In the Pyramid Age, royal tombs and funerary temples were a single complex. But 1300 years later, the two were built separately, reflecting a new era of opulence epitomising the greatest dynasty of all, the 18th, the time of Amenhotep III. For centuries, pretty much the only visible remains of Amenhotep's funerary temple were his two colossal statues. Now archaeologist Dr. Hurig Saruzian and her team are finally uncovering the full splendour of this once mighty monument.
You touch and it's
like glass.
Yeah.
Covering over 86 acres, this was not a tomb like the pyramids, but a huge complex, the largest funerary temple ever created.
It's a massive,
It's unbelievable.
area.
You have to imagine, this is only the major temple, the main temple. You have to imagine other temples, processional ways, Sphinx avenues, magazines, workshops, treasures, pools, gardens, priest house, administrative houses. All this was a big city in the capital.
Overwhelming in
Yeah,
size.
it is.
This grand design was built as the place where his soul could be worshipped for eternity, while his mummified body was buried in the Valley of the Kings nearby. But during his lifetime, inside the temple, a permanent priesthood was employed, all ruled over by the pharaoh. Amenhotep's massive statues flanked the temple's main entrance. Beyond them lay a second pair, and then a third. Amenhotep's image repeated throughout the temple complex.
Our story begins on the banks of the Nile River, whose rich silt deposits nurtured the ancient lands of the pyramids and pharaohs. However, the Nile does not stop flowing where ancient Egypt ended, instead snaking south into the heart of Africa, allowing many other civilizations to thrive upon its shores. The most prominent of these were the Nubians, a people who flourished in what is now Sudan. Around 2500 BC, the first powerful state in Nubia, Kerma, rose to prominence. Running roughly parallel to the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, the Nubian people of Kerma were sophisticated agriculturalists, cattle herders, ceramicists, and metal workers. They left behind huge ritualistic tombs known as defufes. Around 1550 BC, the armies of the Egyptian New Kingdom thundered southwards in their war chariots and brought Kerma under their rule. Egypt ruled over Nubia for roughly 500 years, during which time the Nubian peoples adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture, including the worship of Egyptian gods like Amun and Isis. Despite being under their occupation, the Nubians maintained much internal autonomy and a distinct identity. Egyptian art at the time depicted Nubian nobility with darker skin than their own, bedazzled in large earrings, and draped in robes made of exotic animal skins, making them very distinct from the average Egyptian. In the immediate aftermath of the apocalyptic Bronze Age collapse, which devastated all civilization on the eastern Mediterranean, the Nubians were able to reassert their independence, establishing the Kingdom of Kush, with its capital at the Amunic cult center of Napata. In the centuries that followed, the Nubians were able to reverse the tides against their former conquerors. It would be around 745 BC that the mighty Kushite king Piye would take advantage of unrest in the north to launch an invasion, occupying Egypt and becoming the first pharaoh of its 25th dynasty. Egypt flourished under Nubian rule, as the Kushite pharaohs oversaw a renaissance in Egyptian art and religion. This included the first widespread construction of pyramids in nearly 2,000 years, both in Egypt proper and in their homeland of Nubia.
Egypt has always traditionally been given prominence as the height of ancient culture. Nubia is now coming into its own and is being understood to be of equal importance. It is different from ancient Egypt, but it is equally important and not just an adjunct to this Egyptian culture. What archaeologists do when they pull material from the ground or when they translate texts, they bring their own cultural baggage to that interpretation and the baggage of the times that they live in. And so it's imperative that we go back and continually reassess the things that we take as facts. Many of the early archaeologists came to the study of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia from the perspective of Semitic languages or the study of the Hebrew Bible. And it was very important to them to bring Egypt specifically into the sphere of biblical studies. And so they had to carve Egypt away from Africa to bring it into that sphere. And the way that they did that was they used race. So these early archaeologists effectively made ancient Egypt white in the sense that they made it part of a dominant Western culture, and ancient Nubia was separated from that. It was black. And this was how they took Egypt out of Africa and put it into this Semitic sphere, this biblical sphere. And it's only in recent decades, the last 3-4 decades, that Egyptology has really moved away from that. And scholars who are studying Nubia are really given the chance to give a voice to this Nubian material that it wasn't given much of a chance to have in the past. Someone asks me, what was the ancient Egyptians' view of X? I immediately think of a two-pronged view, because the ancient Egyptians had an official view of many things, and this is the view that would be put up on the walls of temples and on the walls of the tombs of the elites. That was an official, let's say, state-sanctioned view. That bore little to no resemblance to what people actually may have thought. It was the official view. So when you look at Nubia as depicted on the walls of temples in Egypt, you will see Nubians being crushed under the chariot wheels of the king. You will see Nubians being dragged back to Egypt enslaved. What we see on the ground in terms of archaeological evidence is quite different. We see people who had Nubian names, people who were using Nubian material culture, living within Egypt, working in Egypt, marrying people with Egyptian names. So something quite different from the very intense militaristic scenes that you see in temples. When George Reisner excavated Kerma, he found the statue, a large, beautiful statue of Senui, and also a statue partially destroyed of Jaffa Hapi, her husband. It was a very large tomb, and with size in Egypt and in Nubia, we tend to assume ruler, or someone very important, which usually translates to ruler. We now understand, yes, this was a ruler's tomb. It is a completely different time period than Jaffa, Happy, and Senewi lived in. Much later, we understand it to be a local ruler, so it was a Kerman official, who, for reasons we can guess at, brought or had these two statues brought to Kerma and put in his tomb. It could have been an appropriation of Egyptian culture in general, just to show that, yes, I can own these things that are Egyptian wonderful works of art. Because what we're saying, if you read between the lines, is whoever owns these statues is a powerful person. And that means this art has power.
Of the apocalyptic Bronze Age collapse, which devastated all civilization on the eastern Mediterranean, the Nubians were able to reassert their independence, establishing the Kingdom of Kush, with its capital at the Amunic cult center of Napata. In the centuries that followed, the Nubians were able to reverse the tides against their former conquerors. It would be around 745 BC that the mighty Kushite king Piye would take advantage of unrest in the north to launch an invasion. occupying Egypt and becoming the first pharaoh of its 25th dynasty. Egypt flourished under Nubian rule, as the Kushite pharaohs oversaw a renaissance in Egyptian art and religion. This included the first widespread construction of pyramids in nearly 2,000 years, both in Egypt proper and in their homeland of Nubia.
Let us see the area 4,500 years ago, or 2500 BCE. Two major rivers existed in the northwestern region of the Indian subcontinent, the Indus River and the Ghaggar-Hakra River. Harappa is in the upper area of the river, while the Mohenjo-Daro is further down in the middle section. And Dholavira is located at the mouth of the Ghaggar-Hakra River. These large cities were surrounded by about 2,000 towns and villages.
The ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro is one of the first urban centers in human history. Nestled in southern Pakistan's Indus River Valley, Mohenjo-Daro is the largest and best preserved city of the Indus civilization, the earliest known civilization of the Indian subcontinent. Mohenjo-Daro was built around 2500 BC, about the same time the Great Pyramids were being built in Egypt, and it spanned a surface area of nearly 500 acres, an incredible size for a city of this time period. Because of Mohenjo-Daro's grand scale, archaeologists believe it may have served as a seat of power for the Indus civilization. The city was divided into two districts, the Citadel and the Lower Town. The Citadel is home to the city's exceptional monuments, including the Great Bath, a 900-square-foot tank fed from the Indus River. Mohenjo-Daro also had a sophisticated water system. Houses had baths and toilets, and the town featured both an elaborate sewage system and fresh water in 700 wells throughout the city. The Roman baths, some of history's most famous waterway systems, weren't constructed until many hundreds of years after Mohenjo-Daro's Great Bath. Mohenjo-Daro has no places of worship or governance, such as palaces, royal tombs, or temples. This may indicate that the society was not built around state interests like the Egyptian and Mesopotamian societies at the time. Rather, the class structure of Mohenjo-Daro may have been relatively equal. The city's second district, the Lower Town, may demonstrate the society's egalitarian structure. The Lower Town, with its intricate water system, was home to between 20,000 to 40,000 people. Unlike many urban areas of its time, it was laid out in a grid system similar to modern-day city blocks. After approximately 600 years, the city collapsed. No one is quite sure why, but the cause could potentially have been a change within the culture, or in the path of the river. Without its crucial source of water, the city's residents may have moved away, leaving Mohenjo-Daro nearly abandoned. In 1911, nearly 4,000 years after the city fell into ruin, archaeologists paid their first visit. The ensuing decades of excavations have unearthed countless clues that tell the tale of Mohenjo-Daro, but it still holds secrets for us to discover.
These seals were quite novel discoveries, as they held important clues to the Indus Valley civilization. More than 4,000 seals made of mud or soft talc were found in the Indus Valley. Inscriptions or drawings of people and animals were commonly depicted on these Indus Valley seals. The unicorn was the most common theme on them. It could be deduced that the seals were printed on plates and other objects to denote ownership by the owner of the seal. And similar seals have also been found in the Mesopotamian civilization ruins in Iraq. Not only were similar animals depicted, but even the inscriptions and symbols were identical. What implications does this have?
There were two overland routes. There was one overseas route. Trade is clearly established on the basis of archaeological finds and Mesopotamian literary records between Mesopotamia and Harappan civilization, and also between Harappan civilization and some of the Iranian civilization, and on the basis of humped bull motif, carnelian beads, estetite vessels, which means that objects of Mesopotamian origin being found in Harappa and objects of Harappan origin being found in Mesopotamia clearly testify to the fact that there was trade.
"4,500 years ago, it was likely that large boats sailed from the Indus River to the Arabian Sea. About 5 million people inhabited the banks of the Indus River, clustered in over 2,000 towns and villages. The crafts and goods they made were traded with other lands. Mesopotamia was the main trading place. Even though trade between the two civilizations was small, the land route linked the two. As trade volume grew, sea routes were established. Numerous trading cities sprung up along the route, and the Mohenjo-Daro was the most prominent city. Mohenjo-Daro was the Manhattan of its time. Goods were bountiful in the streets, and laborers toiled to carry them. Merchants made deals in tall buildings. is drinkable water accessible everywhere at any time.
The Indus Valley civilization is mysterious. We can't read their script, don't know their language either. But what about their religion? What were the beliefs and practices of the ancient people of the Indus Valley civilization? Now, don't get me wrong, we don't have too much evidence as to figure out what they would have practiced. No gigantic monuments to the gods, no magnificent temples, none of that. But these people have left behind many clues that we could piece together to find out about their religious practice. So where do we start? Let's take this Indus seal, the well-known Pashupati seal. Here we can see a seated man with horns on his head, sitting on a kind of stool surrounded by countless other animals. But if you look closely to his head, you will be able to observe that he has not only one, but 4 heads, 3 of which are clearly visible in the front view. Paired with the animals around him and the horns on his head, this man can be interpreted as some kind of god. If you look at some more Indus seals, this becomes very evident. We keep finding images of gods that are in some way connected to animals and nature. Take this seal for example. Here we can clearly see a goddess in the center, also with horns, but seems to be not in a human form, but morphed with another creature to create a kind of mythical creature. I mean, if you think about it, it does kind of resemble the centaurs of Greek mythology. This is not a lone seal either. This seal clearly depicts the same goddess. Meanwhile, in this seal, we see the same god from the Pashupati seal appear on the far right. On the left, you can see a man hunting or spearing down an animal. We don't have to leave it at that. This copper plate inscription, the longest Indus inscription, features a similar god with some kind of offering and a plant sprouting behind him. These nature and animal or hunting themes are extremely evident in Indus seals. And so the gods they worshipped must have been hunting gods, plant gods, or gods associated with certain animals or nature. The significance of animals in particular in Indus culture is very clearly seen by literally any and every Indus seal. You see below the legend an image of some kind of animal which will vary from seal to seal, and so their mythology must have been very heavily affected by the creatures that lived around them. Speaking of mythology, what was that like? What tales did they tell to their children? What tales did the priests glorify about? Again, I'm taking another seal for an example. This one clearly depicts a man fighting off 2 lions single-handedly. We have many such seals of the same event. Right now you might not recognize anything special from this, but it is actually very similar to Gilgamesh in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh fighting off 2 lions. Even the imagery is almost exactly the same. This could mean that both civilizations shared similar myths and tales, and a sort of cultural exchange happened. Indus mythology would have therefore heavily revolved around animals and beasts. Tales like a man killing a foul beast, taming them or fighting them, these themes seem very common. Animals could have also played a role in the Indus mythology as gods or servants or representations of gods themselves. In this seal, for example, you can see someone worshipping an unknown goddess to the left, who is standing inside a peepal tree. Below seems to be a kind of procession or parade of either worshippers or heavenly servants or gods of some sort. But next to it, you can see a strange animal, 2-horned, bigger than the other people, and standing behind the worshipper. This could have been some sort of mythical creature as well, just going to show how much these peoples integrated their surroundings into mythology. And in this seal, a horned man with a tail fights a lion, again tying to the epic of Gilgamesh. Then there is also the concept of gods or mythical creatures having multiple heads or arms. This is also a very big theme of Indus seals and is attested by many of them. All this suggests that the Indus seal was not a shamanic or primitive one, but a well-constructed one with most likely their own pantheons, myths, and legends comparable to the Mesopotamian and Egyptian ones. But when it comes to mythology, you can't miss the flood myths. They are common everywhere and vary to an extent, But it would be hard to believe that the Indus people didn't have a kind of variation or sort of flood myth. I mean, they were, after all, situated on the banks of a great river that flooded. Although we have no seals depicting a flood myth for the Indus, they probably had a variation of this legend. So that's the mythology aspect of things. But there is something else that is very interesting about their gods. Take a look at the Pashupati seal once again. Look at the deity's head. Yeah, he has horns of some sort, which is very common, by the way, and what may seem to be a crown or headdress at first. But if you compare this seal to other seals of the same god and style, you will actually realize that it is a plant or tree. Scholars have associated this with the peepal tree. So what we get is a deity sitting in a lotus meditative posture under a peepal tree. Sound familiar? Yes, this practice of meditation is so common in later Hinduism and other traditions, and the peepal tree is revered as sacred in Hinduism. It's the exact same thing here. We know the Indus people knew of the peepal tree because of their seals, so the holiness of the peepal tree, the lotus position, and this entire practice that just seems so Indian could have been borrowed from the earlier Indus faith. The peepal tree was not such an important thing in the times of the Rig Veda and is barely mentioned, while later it gains importance. That importance of the peepal tree must have come from the Indus faith that preceded it. This is not the only place where we see cultural continuity. Let's look back at the Pashupati seal. Remember the 4 faces of which 3 are in view? Take a picture of the Hindu god Brahma, or for that matter, any Hindu god with 4 heads, and you will see he is literally portrayed in the exact same manner. The many arms of the Hindu gods can also be attributed to the many heads, arms, and legs of Indus mythological creatures. And so in this way, the Indus faith has exerted a massive amount of influence on Hinduism, and cultural continuity definitely existed. So that was the beliefs and religion of the Indus.
Mudskippers are fish, with specially adapted fins enabling them to walk.
A few months back, I had visited the ruins of the Harappan city of Lothal in northwestern India, which is about 85 kilometers, or just over 50 miles, from the modern metropolis of Ahmedabad, India. Compared to Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, the two most famous Harappan sites, Lothal is rather small, but it contains many of the characteristics of a typical Harappan city, and for this reason, it's a good place to explore. The name Lothal means place of the dead, but it's not the real name of the city, which no one knows. The site was excavated between the years 1955 to 1962 by Dr. S.R. Rao, whose team unearthed many of the town's structural remains. Rao estimated that Lothal thrived roughly between the years 2500 to 1900 BC, and perhaps at its height was home to around 15,000 people. Like many other Harappan cities and towns, Lothal was divided into two main sections, an upper town, or Acropolis, and a lower town, the latter which was protected from flooding by a 13-meter thick brick wall. In Lothal, the main difference between the Acropolis and lower town sections were that the houses of the Acropolis stood on a 3-meter high platform and had better civic amenities, such as covered underground drains, and more elaborate baths made out of standard Harappan burnt bricks. If Lothal had an upper or elite class, then they would have definitely lived in this area. The lower town was further divided up into two sectors, one of these being the city's main commercial center, where workers, craftsmen, artisans, and merchants set up shop, and a more residential district where these and other people probably lived. Lothal's most prominent structure is the man-made dockyard constructed out of burnt bricks. While today the Arabian Sea is about 17 kilometers, or 10.5 miles away, during the primary phases of its occupation, Lothal was much closer to, if not on the sea. The dockyard consisted of a tidal basin, or dock, connected to a canal, which allowed boats to enter and exit the basin during high and low tides. The basin itself was about 214 meters long and 36 meters wide, and had an estimated depth of around 4 to 6 meters. While some have stated that it may have just been nothing more than a large water tank, the discovery of stone ship anchors, as well as evidence that seawater was contained within the brick enclosure, support the hypothesis that this was indeed a dockyard. Nearby was a warehouse that was probably used to store goods that were loaded onto or unloaded from trading ships.
In this experiment, we see two continents separated by an ocean. Now watch what happens as the plates converge. As one plate subducts or dives beneath the other, the ocean basin closes. The continental crust, which is lighter than oceanic crust, cannot be subducted. Instead, as the continents collide, the crust thickens and is forced up. Note how the sand is folded and faulted. We see similar structures in the rocks in mountains.
कश्मीर जन्नत जैसी है और हम यहाँ के बकरवाल है जैसे जन्नत के बकरवाल है। हाँ, यहाँ हवा है, ठंडा पानी है और मैदान है, तल्ला है, तो पहाड़ी बहुत ऊंची है, तो जैसे जन्नत में जैसे जन्नत के नज़ारे हैं ऐसे ही कश्मीर के नज़ारे होते हैं। सुल्तान के जाल चली नाम खो अच्छा का कितने रोज जाए ओके देखे मिल जाननी ना गुजरों ने मिसाल छुड़िया इन गुजरों ने मुझे जलाया। ओ ये देखते इस तरह जिस तरह रफल देखती है बोलता मिलिटेंट है। हाँ तार में फंस गया आग जलाओ वो सारी आज सुनो नहीं आई समझ और सफ़र की तैयारी हो गई बहुत लंबा सफ़र करना पीर पंजाल क्रॉस करना है। पीर पंजाल बहुत लंबा है और मुश्किल का सफ़र है। उस पे बारिश का खतरा है, उस पे फाके का खतरा है, समझो कि एक किस्म का उसके साथ ये मुकाबला है। अल्लाह खैर नाल पहुंचावे। ना रे आज फिर कैसे बारिश है पता नहीं क्या करेगी। सुल्तानो एक बच्चों चांगो ना करी चल बारिश आ गई तू के लौट गए उसका जल्दी चल मौत आ गई
The year is 1656. Your body is racked by violent chills. Your head pounds, your muscles are too weak to sit up, and you feel like rancid, hard-boiled eggs are squeezing out of your neck and armpits. In your feverish state, you see a strange-looking man approach, his face obscured by a beak-like mask, his body covered from head to toe. He examines you, and even without seeing his face, you know the diagnosis. You have the plague. The plague stands out as one of the most terrifying and destructive diseases in human history. It swept across large parts of Afro-Eurasia in 3 separate pandemics, starting in the 6th, 14th, and 19th centuries, killed tens of millions of people, and had, in the best of cases, about a 40% survival rate. The European plague doctor, with his beaked mask and wizard-like robes, is one of the images most popularly associated with plague today. He's often found in books and films about the 14th century pandemic known as the Black Death. The only problem is, that's about as accurate as placing a modern surgeon at the court of Louis XIV in Versailles. The confusion is understandable, though. The Black Death had several aftershocks, including a series of devastating outbreaks in Western Europe during the 17th century. This is when the iconic plague doctor actually emerged on the scene. First described in the early 17th century, the outfit consisted of a hood with crystal eyepieces and a beak filled with a pungent combination of herbs and compounds. This could include cinnamon, pepper, turpentine, roast copper, and powdered viper flesh. This recipe was inspired by the famed 2nd century Greco-Roman physician Galen and was thought to ward off poisoned air known as miasma. People believed this bad air spread plague after emanating from swamps and sources of decay, such as dead plants or animal carcasses. In earlier centuries, doctors across Europe carried metal pomanders filled with similar mixtures, and it's possible that the beak evolved as a hands-free alternative. The rest of the costume, which included an oiled leather robe, boots, and gloves, acted as kind of an early hazmat suit, likely designed to block miasma from entering through the skin's pores. While this shows some basic understanding that plague spread from one place to another, these doctors couldn't know that in most cases, the true culprit was a tiny flea transmitting the bacteria Yersinia pestis from one person or animal to another. It's possible that the plague doctor's outfit may have provided some unintentional protection from flea bites. However, not enough information survives to know whether the costumed doctors fared any better than their ordinarily robed counterparts. It's no surprise that this bizarre getup has captured popular imagination, despite the fact that its use was limited to a few places in Italy and France during the 17th and early 18th century.
What Einstein said was this: if you don't have anything out in space, that's a flat space. If you were to take a planet, a ball, whatever it is, a rocket ship, and roll it, it would make a straight line in that space-time. Watch it up on the screen. I roll it, and it makes a straight line. But according to Einstein, if you go and have a star, that star will bend space-time in that extra dimension that you can't see. See, you can't see it bent up over there, but you can see it here. And that bent space-time, if you roll the ball, see, now it looks like it's going around and around that planet. So according to Einstein, there is no connection between the star and the planet. What you have is the star bending the fabric of space. And this little
Трогать. Вот она очень сухая, ей 150 лет, все нормально, да? Ага. Все, поехали. Пойдем, мой дорогой. А, ты вот так вот. Камера работает?
Работает.
А вот это вы видели?
О, Господи.
Ну, у вас глаза еще больше стали.
Наверное.
Нам удалось вас удивить?
Да, а как...
Have you ever seen a bird that can eat bones? The bearded vulture can. The bearded vulture is Europe's rarest vulture. This amazing bird is the only vulture species that specializes in feeding on bones. It does this by dropping them from great heights onto rocks below. The impact shatters the bones, allowing the vulture to feast on the marrow inside. The acid concentration in the bearded vulture's stomach has been estimated to be of pH about 1. Large bones will be digested in about 24 hours, aided by slow mixing or churning of the stomach content.
The divine right to rule. As if moving to a new capital wasn't enough, sometime between year 2 and year 5, with the swift rise of Aten as the primary state god, Akhenaten made a daring move that rocked the state religion. He banned the worship of Amun, closed his temples, and ordered the widespread and thorough erasure of the name and image of Amun. We have evidence that this erasure campaign was waged from Nubia in the south all the way up to the Sinai Peninsula, over 3,200 kilometers away. The destruction of Amun was so widespread that some Egyptologists theorize it could only have been accomplished with the help of the army. Just imagine the effort required to carry out such a widespread campaign. And let me remind you, all of this was happening during Amun's height as the most popular Egyptian god. He made some enemies by doing this. In the tombs around Thebes, the name Amun was obliterated, chipped off the walls. The name was also removed from the tip of Hatshepsut's obelisk. Just picture that. Akhenaten presumably made some guy climb all the way up there with hammer and chisel just to destroy the name of Amun. He even ordered the destruction of his own father's name. Remember that Amenhotep contains the name of Amun, so even though it was the name of his father, Akhenaten had his name destroyed, even within Amenhotep III's own funerary temple, the temple meant to honor him and his legacy. It's still not exactly clear why Akhenaten held so much animosity against Amun, but scholars have often suggested that it may have been for political reasons.
At about 6 o'clock in the morning on September 14th, 2015, scientists witnessed something no human had ever seen. 2 black holes colliding. Both about 30 times as massive as our sun, they had been orbiting each other for millions of years. As they got closer together, they circled each other faster and faster. Finally, they collided and merged into a single, even bigger black hole. A fraction of a second before their crash, they sent a vibration across the universe at the speed of light. And on Earth, billions of years later, a detector called the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, or LIGO for short, picked it up. The signal only lasted a fifth of a second and was the detector's first observation of gravitational waves. What are these ripples in space? The answer starts with gravity, the force that pulls any 2 objects together. That's the case for everything in the observable universe. You're pulling on the Earth, the Moon, the Sun, and every single star, and they're pulling on you. The more mass something has, the stronger its gravitational pull. The farther away the object, the lower its pull. If every mass has an effect on every other mass in the universe, no matter how small, then changes in gravity can tell us about what those objects are doing. Fluctuations in the gravity coming from the universe are called gravitational waves. Gravitational waves move out from what caused them like ripples on a pond, getting smaller as they travel farther from their center. But what are they ripples on? When Einstein devised his theory of relativity, he imagined gravity as a curve in a surface called space-time. A mass in space creates a depression in space-time, and a ball rolling across a depression will curve like it's being attracted to the other mass. The bigger the mass, the deeper the depression, and the stronger the gravity. When the mass making the depression moves, that sends out ripples in space-time. These are gravitational waves. What would a gravitational wave feel like? If our bodies were sensitive enough to detect them, we'd feel like we were being stretched sideways while being compressed vertically, and in the next instant, stretched up and down while being compressed horizontally. Sideways, then up and down. This back and forth would happen over and over as the gravitational wave passed right through you.
An utterly wondrous achievement. Astronomers using the Event Horizon Telescope have taken the first ever photograph of a black hole. Here's the story. About 100 years ago, Albert Einstein gave us a new description of the force of gravity, in which gravity exerts its influence through warps and curves in the fabric of space and time. Just a couple years later, Karl Schwarzschild, he was a German astronomer who was stationed on the Russian front during World War I and charged with calculating artillery trajectories. He somehow gets a hold of Einstein's manuscript and realizes something amazing. If you take a spherical object and you squeeze it down to a sufficiently small size, according to Einstein's math, the gravitational pull will be so enormous that nothing will be able to escape, not even light. And that is what we mean by a black hole. Now, when Einstein caught wind of these results, he didn't believe it. He didn't think that these objects would actually be out there in the universe. And yet, in the ensuing decades, theoretical developments began to mount showing that black holes were the inevitable outcome of massive stars that had used up their nuclear fuel, undergone a supernova explosion, and the resulting core would have no ability to withstand the pull of gravity and would collapse down into a black hole. And the observational case, it also began to mount. Studies of the center of our Milky Way galaxy showed stars whipping around the center at such enormous speeds that the only explanation for the object that could exert the powerful gravity responsible for that motion would be a very massive black hole, perhaps 4 million times the mass of the Sun. And perhaps the most convincing observational evidence to date actually comes from gravitational waves. When we received the first ripples in the fabric of space back in 2015, the only explanation for the pattern of those waves was two black holes very distant that collided, setting off this tidal wave in space that we were able to detect. Now, even with the mounting theoretical and observational evidence, we had never directly seen a black hole itself. And that is what now has changed. Using 8 radio telescopes from around the world, the Event Horizon Telescope, the name of this consortium, has now taken the first ever snapshot of a black hole itself. And here it is. The image provides the first direct test of Einstein's theory in the strong gravitational field of a black hole. And as far as we can tell, Einstein once again comes through with flying colors. And in many ways, this image really is an emblem of the power of the human intellect to explore, to discover, and to understand the cosmos.
Some of those instruments you saw in the video are sounding prototypes. Some of them are non-sounding prototypes. But we have used modern technologies to recreate the sound, to like using computer-based sound modeling and synthesis and whatnot, to approximately reach to the kind of sound that instrument would produce using variety of methods. So let us talk about the evidence in Harappan archaeology, what we have found till now in Harappan archaeology, and then I'll move on to Mesopotamia, which is the main subject of today's talk. So we have harps which are seen on seals. There is a sign in the Harappan script which clearly appears to be inspired from an arched harp, a harp shaped like a bow. And then we have ocarinas or vessel flutes, which are found miniaturized as toy whistles from various Harappan sites. Then there is long barrel drum. You can see it there, that one.
Earthquakes around the world concentrate mostly along the boundaries of tectonic plates. The largest earthquakes occur on the highlighted plate boundaries called subduction zones, like the one offshore Japan. Here, the Pacific plate moves westward towards Japan at a rate of 9 centimeters per year. A cross-section through this region reveals the structure of the subduction system, showing the Pacific plate descending underneath the overriding plate on which Japan sits. The plates are made of elastic rock, and the asthenosphere beneath them consists of rocks that are elastic on short time scales while flowing viscously at the time scales of years. Over longer geological time scales, the subducting plate sinks slowly into the asthenosphere. To see how earthquakes fit into this picture, we zoom in on the region around the plate contact, and we also slow down our clock to focus on processes occurring over much shorter time scales. When we do this, we can recognize 4 distinct stages of earthquake cycle deformation. We start in the time period before a major earthquake, called the interseismic period. This interval lasts several decades to centuries to even millennia in some cases. During the interseismic stage, a large part of the plate contact is locked by friction. The subducting plate continues to move at several centimeters per year, causing the overriding plate to shorten and bend downward. Depending on their location, nearshore communities may record this as slow uplift or as drowning of the land. The earthquake happens at 12 on our clock. At this point, stresses have become so high that the plate contact breaks and the two plates slip rapidly past each other. This rapid slip produces seismic waves that propagate away from the fault and may cause damage in the region nearby. This vertical motion of the seafloor may also generate a tsunami, as the water column is abruptly raised and then falls to the sides. During the earthquake, the overriding plate stretches seaward relative to its pre-earthquake position, with uplift near the subduction trench and subsidence near the shore.
river valley is the most is the best possible location for a civilization or for a city to exist. So when you find that a river has changed its course because of tectonic shifts, then obviously the city does not exist there. It ceases to exist. So tectonic movements, floods from the rivers, natural disasters, these are some of the causes which have been held responsible for the decline of the Harappan civilization.
Biz orospular yanarken mahalleli onun ateşine odun attığını çok iyi biliyoruz. Bizleri yok sayıp hedef gösteremezsiniz. Biz orospular seks işçileri varız, var olacağız. Götümüz, başımız aynı oynuyor. Tamam. Götümüz, başımız, tüm zırhlığımız, transfımız, dönmeliğimizle bugün buradayız. Sizden korkmuyoruz, suratlarınıza bakıyoruz. Bizlerdeyiz, siz gideceksiniz. Tayyip kaç kaç kaç, taraftar geliyor. Tayyip kaç kaç kaç, taraftar geliyor. Neredesin aşkım? Buradayım aşkım. Neredesin aşkım? Buradayım aşkım. Neredesin aşkım? Buradayım aşkım.
Like a nation that marks the entire month of June to celebrate Gay Pride. Participants recently held a parade in New York City where they made it clear they're queer and they're coming for your children. Our first president would have swallowed his wooden teeth. No wonder parents are pushing back against gender fluidity instruction in public schools. Christians are standing up, not discriminating against gays, but against childhood indoctrination. They're also opposing unrestricted abortion, and for that, churches are under attack. The most recent, $100,000 in damages done to the Fowler's UMC Church in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. We don't know if the vandals acted simply out of anger against God or because the church had taken a moral stance on a controversial issue. The Family Research Council reports nearly 400 churches were attacked from January 2018 to September 2022. And incidents have skyrocketed in the first 3 months of this year, with 69 recorded attacks. That's 3 times more than during the first quarter of 2022. And it's not only attacks against Christians and their houses of worship that are on the rise. American Jews are experiencing increased acts of anti-Semitism. This week, members of a group calling themselves the Goyim Defense League unfurled Nazi flags in front of the Chabad Kab synagogue in Marietta, Georgia. Worshippers were just starting services inside at the time.
In the year 1700, India's share in the world's economy was an astounding 27%, more than all of Europe combined. 250 years later, India's share had dropped to less than 3%, and its people were left impoverished. What happened? Strap in, adventurers. We're about to dive into a dark and messy history. Welcome to 18th century India. In 1707 CE, the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb sends the empire into a decades-long spiral. In his wake, an endless parade of weak princelings forced themselves upon the peacock throne. With the Mughal Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, regional powers jostle for supremacy. Land grabs and title claims, infighting and betrayal. India is vulnerable. The situation is so precarious that, in 1739, Persian Emperor Nadir Shah invades North India and sacks Delhi. During this period of disorder, the British sensed opportunity. Leveraging their unique advantages as a foreign power, they bribed and blasted their way into a dominant position in the subcontinent. India was no stranger to dealing with foreign aggression, but the British were not like those who had come before. They were not like Nadir Shah, who looted and simply left. Nor were they like the Huns, who, while shedding Gupta blood, became Indian themselves. Yes, the British were different, for they saw India as an inexhaustible gold mine, whose resources were to be forever extracted. By the time India won its independence in 1947, its native institutions had been demolished, its economy deindustrialized, its trade networks severed, and its people more deeply divided by caste and creed. In just 200 years of colonial rule, the India that once inspired the world was unmade. The halcyon days of India are over. She has been drained of all the wealth she once possessed, and her energies have been cramped by a sordid system of misrule. The deliberate bleeding of India by the British was so extreme that famed American scholar Will Durant referred to it as the greatest crime in all of history. So let's pull back the curtain and see what India was like before colonialism. In the 19th century, the American J.T. Sunderland wrote about the India that the British found when they arrived. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or Asia. Her textile goods were famous all over the civilized world. So was her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones. So was her pottery, her porcelains and ceramics. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great merchants, businessmen, bankers, and financiers. She was not only a great shipbuilding nation, but had commerce and trade which extended to all civilized countries. That may seem like heavy-handed praise, but the record does show that pre-colonial India was a dominant manufacturing economy. Let's take a closer look at the textile, shipbuilding, and metalworking industries. India was a textile superpower for most of its long history. There were many textile centers in the subcontinent. Coastal Andhra was a block printing hub, for example, while Gujarat and Bengal were known for their high-end woven products. There was global demand for these items. In fact, India enjoyed a mind-blowing 25% share of the global textile trade by the mid-18th century. This thriving textile trade had knock-on effects for the entire economy. For example, the popularity of Indian textiles led to the creation of stable international distribution networks. By piggybacking on these networks, other Indian artisans could sell their goods worldwide at a reduced cost. As a result, many different industries flourished alongside the Indian textile industry. We know that international trade was conducted primarily along maritime routes, and so the Indian shipbuilding industry had developed into a behemoth too. A significant number of Indian ports were engaged in the shipbuilding industry. Dhaka, Masulipatam, Surat, Calicut, Quilon, and many, many others. Entire rural communities were involved in the production and processing of materials used to construct ships. Quality was paramount. Consider the Bengali merchant fleet in the early 17th century. The fleet consisted of nearly 5,000 ships, each capable of carrying up to 500 tons of goods. These ships were constructed in Bengali ports by native artisans who had the skills to craft elaborate wood, iron, and brass fittings. According to one British maritime observer, Indian vessels combine elegance and utility and are models of fine workmanship. Merchant contracts indicate that Bengali ships were much more durable than English ships. Bengali ships had an average lifespan exceeding 20 years, while English ships were not known to last more than 12. Quite a difference. India was a longtime pioneer in the global steel industry. As early as the 6th century CE, crucible-formed steel, which came to be known as Wootz or Damascus steel in the West, was being produced for export by Indian blacksmiths, particularly along the Malabar coast and in the Deccan. Arab and European officers regularly imported blades from India. While these blades were purchased as wartime implements, they were so robust and beautifully crafted that they also served as a mark of high status in times of peace. Though we've barely scratched the surface, it should already be clear that India was a manufacturing juggernaut, a thriving exporter of high-quality goods to markets throughout the world. How did the British manage to unmake all of that? The fundamental principle of the British has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient to the interests and benefits of themselves. And so, once the British took power, they changed the entire dynamic of the Indian economy to suit their own interests. The first step? Dismantling all native industry. To start, they established a legal monopoly over Indian textile goods and cut off the export market, which immediately disrupted long-standing trade links. Having now made themselves the exclusive buyers of Indian textiles, the British then changed the way that they paid for those goods. Instead of using foreign currency, they paid using the tax revenues extracted from India. The Indian economy stagnated and prices collapsed. Skilled artisans, who once fueled the vibrant Indian economic engine, were now significantly poorer and more restricted than ever before. And it didn't stop there. Soon enough, British manufacturers lobbied their government to completely eliminate the competition from the Indian textile industry. See, despite the restrictions imposed on Indian industry, British manufacturers were still finding it difficult to compete with Indian products. Company soldiers were sent to smash Indian looms. According to several different accounts, they even went around breaking the thumbs of weavers so that they could no longer ply their trade. But that's not all. To ensure that the Indian textile industry could not recover, adapt, or innovate itself back into relevancy, the British imposed an absurdly harsh 80% tariff. This had an immediate catch-22 trap effect. Exporting goods from India to the UK was now economically unviable. But remember, Indians were restricted from selling to anyone else. Similar restrictions were imposed on nearly every branch of manufacturing in India. India was reduced to being a mere exporter of raw materials, like cotton and metal ore, so that the British could sell finished products back to Indians at a premium. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. The colonial deindustrialization process was so complete that by 1947, only 0.7% of India was employed in any form of manufacturing. But skilled workers had to go somewhere, do something. The British monopoly on industrial production drove Indian artisans, merchants, builders, and others into agriculture en masse. In the words of Dr. Charles Hall, India's population has been thrown back upon the soil because Britain's discriminating duties have ruined every branch of native manufacture. Rural wages cratered to historical lows, and in fact, the land itself could not sustain the influx of newly disenfranchised workers. Poor seasonal harvests and droughts gave way to catastrophic famines and mass poverty. With most Indians now converted into peasant cultivators, the British sought to exploit them further. They began to tax cultivators as the primary revenue source for the administration. Taxes were extreme, pegged at 50 to 80% of gross income and calculated before the harvest. The result? Indian cultivators often owed more in taxes than they earned as income. The British knew how harsh this really was. They openly conceded that they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, and that taxes were more than 3 times higher than they had ever been under Indian rulers. To add insult to injury, the British even bragged about it in Parliament. The Indians have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every province has been made a field for higher exaction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above that which the native rulers were able to extort. Colonial taxes were so burdensome that 2/3 of the population in directly ruled British areas fled to the hinterlands, where native Indian lords could at least minimally protect them from financial depredation. The millions who stayed behind could hardly afford to pay taxes, and the situation was worsened by the fact that the British did not negotiate tax payments. Horrors were perpetrated under the guise of sinless mathematical neutrality. Tax defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising rates. Vulnerable peasants were physically tortured to pay up, and when they didn't have the means to pay, the British confiscated their farmland for themselves. Tens of millions of landless peasants were created for the first time in Indian history. By the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's largest source of revenue by far, its largest purchaser of exports, and a source of highly paid employment for both British civil servants and soldiers. and they were all paid for by Indian taxes. Many British officials freely acknowledged the exploitative nature of the colonial enterprise. In fact, a Prime Minister of the UK, the Marquess of Salisbury, himself admitted, "As India is to be bled of money, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested." And just like that, India and its people were bled dry. The fundamental issue of British overlordship was the fact that the British had no intention to become one with the land or to rule it as their own. The British saw India as innately and eternally foreign, and this justified their creation and maintenance of what scholars have referred to as an extractive colony. For comparison's sake, consider the Turkic peoples who invaded India and eventually formed the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Look, the Mughals were no heroes. They imposed unequal taxes, engaged in religious discrimination, plundered local treasuries, visited great violence upon their enemies, and exhibited a Persianized racial arrogance. But one thing is clear: India's wealth was preserved at a foundational level. After nearly 2 centuries of Mughal rule, India was still a dominant economic power, responsible for 27% of global trade. There's a simple reason for that. See, the Mughals had a foreign place of origin, Fergana, but they did not repatriate India's resources to their original homeland. India may not have been Fergana, but it had become their new home, and so their loyalties and energies were owed solely to India. Meanwhile, the British ruled India as disconnected tyrants. The bulk of the revenue from India wasn't reinvested in India. No. It was extracted and repatriated to their distant, foggy homeland. How much? Modern economists have estimated that the total amount of wealth that the British extracted from India is in the ballpark of $43 trillion. Yes, $43 trillion. When taxes are not spent in the country from which they are raised, they constitute an absolute loss and extinction of the whole amount withdrawn from the taxed country. The money might as well be thrown into the sea. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India. Apologists for colonial rule often point to the railways as some sort of extravagant counter to the argument of extraction and divestment. But as modern scholars have pointed out, the railways serve as evidence for how exploitative and inefficient British investment in India really was. First, there's the bold assumption that Indians would not have built railways, like the Japanese or others, either by importing the technology or by developing their own. India had been far too advanced and cutting edge of civilization to not keep up had it been given the opportunity to do so. When the British came to India, the country was the leader of Asiatic civilization. Japan was nowhere. Now, in 50 years, Japan has revolutionized her history with the aid of modern arts of progress, and India, burdened by 150 years of English rule, is condemned to tutelage. But let's ignore that for now. Initially, the Indian railways were positioned as a grand investment scheme for British shareholders. The government guaranteed substantial returns of at least 5% per year, and when the revenues were not enough to pay out these returns, Indian taxpayers covered all the losses. Because of these taxpayer-backed guarantees, construction of the railways was extremely inefficient. Here's a fun stat. Every mile of Indian rail cost £18,000 to construct, as compared to £2,000 for the same mile built in the United States. All the elements of railway construction, steel, wagons, gears, engines, and more, were produced by British manufacturers. Indians weren't even given an opportunity to produce their own manufactured alternatives because the British government imposed restrictions that prevented Indians from competing. Worse still, the essential purpose of the railways was to assist the British enterprise in the exploitation of the natural resources of India. In fact, the railways made it possible for the British to export enormous amounts of grain and other agricultural products, which sparked and exacerbated famines. Over the course of British rule in India, an estimated 35 million preventable deaths were caused by famines. That's millions more than those killed under Stalin or Mao, and that's 5 times more than the Holocaust. The British were directly responsible for this. They mass exported Indian foodstuffs to Britain and other countries in Europe, even during drought periods. Food in India became too expensive for peasants to afford. According to Dr. Charles Hall, India starves so that its annual tax revenue to England may not be diminished by $1. There is plenty of grain in India. The trouble is that the people have been ground down till they are too poor to buy it. The British had no interest in provisioning for Indian lives. Famine non-intervention was official government policy. How ironic, given that heavy-handed British intervention and market manipulation is what sparked the famines in the first place. And when good people, Indians and foreigners, worked together to help famine-affected peasants, the British government made efforts to stop them. They were furious that the government's own failures were being highlighted. Don't believe me? Listen to this British officer in his own words. Scores of corpses were tumbled into old wells because the deaths were too numerous for the relatives to perform funeral rites. Mothers sold their children for a single meal. Husbands flung their wives into ponds to escape the torment of seeing them perish from hunger. But amid these scenes of death, the British government in India was unmoved. Newspapers were persuaded into silence. Strict orders were given to civilians. Do not acknowledge that civilians are dying of hunger. And if you think that Indians would have done a worse job, consider this. There hasn't been a single large-scale Indian famine in the 70-plus years since British rule ended. Not one. Independent India has its flaws, but it has been overwhelmingly better at providing for the care, safety, and prosperity of its own people. And now you know.
These are some plantations in British colonies that operated just 100 years ago. Some of these workers are enslaved Africans. Some are indentured servants from India. Can you tell the difference? After slavery was abolished, Britain replaced its enslaved workers with a cheap alternative: indentured servants. In this new system, millions of people were coerced into signing away their rights for 5 to 10 years at a time. This system is not ancient history. Some of its survivors could still be alive.
गिरमिट कमाई है, बहुत दुख तकलीफ काटे के पड़ा। अरे हम गोरा लोग लाश से मारे इसे। अच्छा। हाँ। गोरा लोग लाश से मारे, काम नहीं करो, चाबुक लगावे गाड़ी पर। हाँ। कोई सुनवाई नहीं। हाँ। गिरमिट तुम्हारी।
These workers became bound to overseas employers where they endured harrowing abuse and exploitation for the duration of their contract.
I would call the system of indenture a hidden history, and it is and has been deliberately obscured from our national narrative.
Maria Kaladine's great-grandfather was recruited from India through this exact system. He ended up toiling at a sugar plantation in British Guyana for years on end. After seeing how her family's past had been buried, Maria decided to specialize in the study of Indian indenture.
We know about it because the British kept the receipt. They are there, all the receipts are there. They are there for everyone to see.
British colonizers took portraits of these workers after taking them from India to work in overseas colonies. Most would never return. Have a look at this record of Indian immigrants. These are the names of Indians who signed an indenture contract and boarded a ship from Calcutta on December 2nd, 1903.
It's an agreement between you and your employer that you will work for a particular number of years.
As soon as they signed that contract, the indentured worker lost much of their freedom. They were treated like human cargo, shipped around the world and bound to their employer for the time period of their contract. They were bought, sold, overworked, and abused in ways far too similar to slavery. Here's how it all went down. By the end of the 1800s, the British Empire was growing to the biggest the world had ever seen. And the natural resources of the colonies, like sugar and cotton, earned the colonizers a lot of money. But labor costs started eating into Britain's massive profits after slavery was abolished. And that's when the British brought in indentured Indians. There were more than 3 million people like Maria's great-grandfather taken from their homes and placed on ships heading to British colonies. The overall trade for these cheap laborers replaced nearly a quarter of the Atlantic slave trade.
What has taken place is a retelling of the history of the 19th century that focuses on the abolition of the slave trade and lauds those involved in the abolition of the slave trade, but does not draw attention in any way to the fact that the system of slavery was replaced by a system which was very brutal, really cruel, and lasted into the 20th century.
The vast majority of indentured workers were from India. As a result of indenture and additional migration, pockets of the Indian community can now be found in nearly every corner of our globe. Over 32 million people of Indian origin live outside of India today, the world's largest diaspora.
India might actually be a kind of replacement for Africa. Think of this from the planter's point of view. They can't imagine a world that will deny them a source of labour, cheap, malleable labour.
In 1838, the first Indian indentured labourers arrived in Guyana, and that was really the beginning of the system of Indian indenture.
Some labourers were forced or kidnapped, but others signed on voluntarily, especially during famine caused by British colonial rule. But most didn't know what they were signing up for. Picture yourself as Maria's great-grandfather, Khaladin, who was living in Pipra, India. Wages are at an all-time low, the class system is not working in your favor, famine plagues your village. Recruiters employed by the British boast about the opportunity of indenture, guaranteeing high wages in return for a 5-year labor contract.
They often, frequently lied about what the terms of the indenture contract were, the distance of the place that people were travelling to, and the nature of the work that they would have to perform.
You can't read or write, but they tell you the contract provides round-trip passage to Calcutta, India, where you put in light labor in exchange for great wealth to bring back to your family. Like more than 2 million other Indians, you stamp your finger and take the deal.
In 1886, my great-grandfather was recruited in Gonda. He was taken to Faizabad. From then, he was taken to Calcutta as an indentured labourer.
What they didn't tell you is you're not really going to Calcutta. You're transferred from depots to shipyards, perhaps told your final destination would be Sri Lanka, but your ocean voyage keeps going and going. The ship itself is rancid, and you are crowded alongside parcels of rice, wheat, and hundreds of other labourers deep within the cargo deck.
Your voyage could have been one that was fraught with deaths from cholera, for example, typhoid, dysentery. It would have been quite traumatic for the immigrants.
You are lucky to survive the diseases that kill roughly 1 in 5 of your fellow passengers. Your peers bond over the shared trauma and call themselves the Jahaji Bai, or Brotherhood of the Boat. 3 months later, you arrive in an unfamiliar land, and someone tells you it is known as British Guyana, a British colony thousands of miles away from home.
He left Calcutta for Guyana, and he indentured for 2 periods of 5 years on 2 estates in Demerara.
This arrival story is way too familiar for the tens of millions of descendants of Indian indenture. Hundreds of thousands of people were taken from China, Japan, and Polynesia as well, forming an extracted community known as coolies, a term that's now an offensive slur. The laborers were shipped across 19 of Britain's colonies, namely in the Caribbean and South Africa. The Dutch and French also took advantage of the cheap labor for their own plantations. Indentured labor was used to cultivate sugar, cotton, and tea, as well as endless train tracks. As early as the 1840s, British officials were calling this a new system of slavery.
The vast majority would never see India again, and would end their lives working in cane fields on the other side of the world.
Indentured workers endured back-breaking work and were whipped and abused by white authorities. Many of them were even housed in the same barracks as formerly enslaved people. Indentured women were sexually abused by white overseers, and sometimes assigned to an Indian man as his housemate and sexual partner.
There is a deliberate kind of denial of anything which does not meet the description of enslaved or free. These binaries are not helpful to people who are trying to express or explain what the system of indenture was. There are conditions of unfree labour that exist between these 2 states, and we must look at them, we must see them, they're part of our history.
And what happened when their indenture contracts ended?
You could then choose to accept a return voyage home to India, or you could again accept a further bounty and stay in the colony, and that's what the majority of people chose to do.
But why would anyone choose to remain indentured? Even after years of laboring, some people didn't earn enough money to bring back home. Others feared they would be shunned when they got back to India, accused of abandoning their family.
So from India, people were taken to Mauritius, to Trinidad, to Guyana, to Fiji, to St. Lucia, Grenada, South Africa, Malaysia. The system was huge, so over 2 million people were part of it. And it has left, obviously, a huge diaspora because the majority of people didn't return in those places. They are a remarkable people because the story of indenture is a story of against all odds survival, and it is a story of great sacrifice.
The trauma lasted lifetimes. In British Guyana, it took generations before descendants of the first indentured laborers were able to get off the plantation, find work, or own property of their own. And British colonizers didn't stop there. In Trinidad, British Guyana, and South Africa, the British inflamed tensions between formerly enslaved Africans and Indians, sowing divisions that continue to plague former colonies.
So we are still able to see the legacies of colonialism to that extent that they are part of the politics in those countries still today.
The indenture system didn't last forever. Indians in British colonies resisted their colonial oppressors for several decades. Although they didn't realize it, resistance efforts across the Indian diaspora culminated almost simultaneously in the early 1900s. In South Africa, individual workers rebelled on their plantations through desertion or suicide. Mahatma Gandhi later joined the Indian South African resistance movement, leading this major strike in 1913. In Fiji, indentured workers had the highest rates of suicide, using it as a form of resistance. In British Guyana, collective organizing ranging from demonstrations to resistance literature shook the nation. Some indentured workers took to writing in Guyanese newspapers to protest their abuse.
I don't think that the British have ever apologized. There is a very violent way of erasing somebody's history without it seeming to be violent, which is just not to talk about it, just not to acknowledge it.
Britain finally outlawed indentureship in 1917, but the system left behind a monumental legacy. Millions of South Asians were scattered across far corners of the world in a multi-generational Indian diaspora. Descendants of indenture in Suriname, Mauritius, British Guyana, and Trinidad cultivated a thriving Indo-Caribbean community. Indian South Africans launched their own political parties and joined in anti-apartheid efforts alongside Black South Africans. The coastal city of Durban, South Africa, became home to the largest population of Indians outside of India and is acclaimed for its Indian culinary scene. Assimilation was bittersweet for Indian migrants. They wanted to hold on to their cultural heritage, but colonial policies made this harder. In some places, it was punishable to speak Hindi. In others, Indians were not allowed to go to school or get jobs without first converting to Christianity.
I am sure that every indentured family has stories like mine, and I wish that we could just have some sense of, the tragedy of it and also the remarkable nature of the people who survived it.
Today, indentured servitude may be a forgotten or even buried history, but many of the tens of millions of descendants want us to know their story.
There isn't really a very good definition of life. What is the difference between something that's alive and something that isn't alive? You might think this is a rather simple question to answer, but in fact, it's not so easy to answer. Should be said, I'm by no means the first person to have considered this question. And if you look in Wikipedia or in a dictionary, you often get rather complex answers. And I wanted a go answering what I think is one of the key questions in biology. And the way I approached it was by exploring 5 of the great ideas of biology. My name is Paul Nurse. I'm a geneticist and cell biologist, and I've just written a book. It's my first book, and it's called What is Life? The cell is really critical for the way I think about life, because it's the simplest entity that expresses characteristics of life. It can grow, it can divide, it can reproduce. And really, all living things, myself, a plant, an insect, is either a single cell or made up of groups of cells acting together. Most people are not excited by yeast. I have to say I am excited by yeast. They just think, well, it's good for making beer and wine and bread maybe. But actually, it's very good as a model for other cells in all sorts of more complicated living things like ourselves. In my laboratory, we found a human gene that was similar to the yeast gene that controls the reproduction of a cell from 1 to 2. And it was clear that that human gene could completely substitute for the yeast gene and control the reproduction of a yeast cell just as well as it could control the reproduction of a human cell. If the same process was controlling the reproduction of a yeast cell as controls the reproduction of a human cell, then this means this was extremely ancient, because yeast and human beings diverged back in the depths of time, deep time, somewhere between 1,000 million years ago and 1,500 million years ago. This meant that every other living thing that we could see, every plant, every animal, and every fungus, was controlled by the same mechanism. A monk called Grigor Mendel was interested in looking at the genetics of peas. And what he did is he crossed different peas with different characteristics, and he counted the different types of offspring that were produced from these pea plants. And he began to notice there were very clear ratios, famous ratios like 3:1 and 9:3 to 3:1. And he realized that maybe what was responsible for inheritance could be described as sort of unitary particle, which could be passed down from one plant to another. But it was the first evidence that there was something which we now would call a gene. The idea of evolution by natural selection is, for me, probably the most beautiful idea in biology. Charles Darwin, who went around the world and collected animals and plants and birds, came up with the idea of evolution by natural selection. He speculated that all living things have hereditary material, that if this hereditary material had some differences that resulted in the living thing being different, and if it was advantageous in the environment in which it found itself, then it would eventually take over the whole population. This has been a revolutionary change in our understanding in biology, because what it leads to is a better designed living thing, but without having a designer. Life is made up of molecules and chemicals. There are many thousands of chemical reactions going on all the time in a little cell. Chemistry is responsible for the growth of the cell, the reproduction of that cell, for its ability to capture energy and use energy. One of the ways in which cells can carry out all of this chemistry is that the cell is made up of lots and lots and lots of little compartments. And it's compartmentation that allows all these different chemistries to occur simultaneously in such a small space. I want to emphasize how fantastic that is. I want you to imagine in a tiny, tiny cell, there's thousands of chemical reactions, all very different, going on all the time, very, very close to each other. So life is chemistry, but life is also built on information. Because life has to constantly manage information. Let's take what I said about chemistry and all those different compartments. That can only occur if there's an information transmission to keep the whole thing coordinated. Let's say a gene is making a substance and it wants to keep that substance at a constant level. As that substance increases, it switches off the gene, and when it decreases, it turns the gene on. But you only really understand that when you realize there's information management going on here. The cell is measuring how much stuff it's got and then using that to determine whether the gene should be switched on or switched off. If we take DNA, we could understand the structure of DNA in terms of how one base is related to another base, but it only makes biological sense when seen to be a digital information storage device. Life is and can only operate through information. It permeates every aspect of how living things work. Putting all these 5 ideas together, I think some principles emerge. Living things are bounded physical entities. The bounded entity is a chemical and informational machine, and then critically, that informational chemical machine in a bounded entity has a hereditary system that determines how it works, a system which has variability, and therefore the whole thing can evolve by natural selection. And that means that the living thing can acquire purpose to be better adapted in the life state it finds itself, and so we can evolve living things from one type into another. And for me, that bounds everything together that emphasizes the core principles underlying life.
there seem to be two great views among scientists, and no doubt would be among others if people knew about it. On the one hand, they hoped that this instrument would never be used in war, and therefore they hoped that we would not start out by using it. On the other hand, they hoped, or other people hoped, that it would put an end to this war, save countless lives, put an end to a butchery that had been going on for many years and had been marked by atrocities, concentration camps, murderous raids on cities, Rotterdam and Dresden and Tokyo itself. And that on the whole we were inclined to think that if it was needed to put an end to the war and had a chance of so doing, we thought that was the right thing to do. We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.